This interview was recorded on April 22nd, 2020. Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Alfredo Deza. Based in Atlanta, Alfredo is a software engineer, open source developer, photographer, and former Olympic athlete. A popular speaker, he has given talks on a range of subjects from professional sports to personal development and open source software. You can follow him on Twitter at Alfredo Deza, and that's with a Z, and check out his website at alfredodeza.com. Along with his colleague Noah Gift, Alfredo is co-author of a couple of Lean Pub books, including Minimal Python, Testing in Python, and Python command line tools. In this interview, we're going to talk about Alfredo's background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about his experience as an author. So thank you, Alfredo, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Len, thank you so much for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here and chatting about all of these interesting things that are going on.
Yeah, we'll get to some of the things that are going on in a little bit. But first, I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story, and you've got a couple, I think. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, well, let's start with the technology stuff, where you grew up and how you first became interested in computers and technology.
Well, I think I could write a book about that. It's just very extensive, but let me try to summarize it in a kind of like an interesting way. So I was born in Peru, and then I lived there until I was 25. That's right around when I got married. My wife is from Peru, and then I never went to, well, I did go to college, but I was there for just a few months. It was really hard for me. I was a professional athlete back in Peru. I was a track and field athlete. I did the high jump, and that consumed most of my life. And I did it very intensely for about 15 years. So I started when I was 10 years old, like training, working out every day. So Saturday, Sundays, New Year's Eve, Christmas, birthdays, and then slowly intensifying to working out between 12 to 17, 18 times per week. So almost every day, twice a day, and sometimes 3 times a day. So pretty hard. And then I went to college, and college was not really making things work for me. And after a few months, I just decided to quit and concentrate in sports. And it all basically kind of like ended when I went to the Olympic Games. I did pretty bad in the Olympics, didn't do too well. And then I came back, got married, and decided to come to the U.S. And it was really brutal coming to the U.S. Back in Peru, we had the support of the family and tons of people that knew me, and that made things go pretty easy. But here in the U.S., we were staying with my sister-in-law, and it was a very small single bedroom basement, and just trying to make ends meet, and slowly but surely trying to find things that would generate income. So I started as a personal trainer for a little while. That was also brutal because I didn't have all of the certifications that gyms were asking me, and like it was really hard. Along the way, I've always liked computers. I was always like enticed by them. In my growing up in my house, we always had a computer. I remember having an Apple, the Apple II, and doing some basic. My older brother knew that, and it's like I had no idea. He's like, "Oh, look at stuff that I can write, and how can I make the computer do this?" And it's like, "Oh, I thought that's interesting," but I didn't know this was programming or like a programming language. I thought it was like a game. And so I started learning home, then bring these, go to such and such, stuff like that. It's like I thought it was pretty neat. I didn't realize it was programming until years later. So now I'm in the US and trying to get things working out, and I started getting interested in Linux because I had my laptop. It got a virus, and it destroyed most of my pictures. And I was like very annoyed, and I was kept hearing this thing where there was like, oh, there's no viruses in Linux, which is of course not entirely true, but 15, 20 years ago, I was like, oh, this sounds enticing enough. I'll just figure it out. And I'll just slap a CD and try to get Linux. I remember trying some version of Red Hat that came with like 5 or 6 CDs and nothing, like my keyboard wasn't working, my mouse was not working. So just like, this is not okay. And PC World magazine had an article that year. I think it was 2004 or 2005. It came out with like the top 20 things in technology that are pretty outstanding. And one of them was the Ubuntu Linux distribution. And the article literally said, the most surprising thing is that the keyboard works and the mouse works. And it's just pretty great. It's like, oh, I have to try this thing. And lo and behold, I tried it. It worked. So I started getting more and more interested in that. And so that coming to the U.S. and struggling with making ends meet, I started picking up books. I remember going to Barnes & Noble, which is a big bookstore here in the U.S., and just like really being interested in learning more and more of these things. And so I got more adept to learning and improving my skills. And it all started when my wife was working at a small media agency. And they needed someone to do something. She heard something about a server and Linux, and they needed someone, and they couldn't find one. And she said, well, my husband can do this. And I raised my hand. I said yes, and that's how my career started. And this is 2007.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing that. There's a lot of threads we could pull on there.
Yes. Yeah.
One thing I always like to ask about is what did your like a common question that comes up is the question of like, what was your first computer, which you already told us about, but how did the computer come into your home? Because often the story I hear about that is that someone's parent had a job in tech or something like that, or else it was a gift for the kids. But it's really interesting to know, because for those listening who might be a little bit younger, it wasn't the case that everybody had a computer at home.
It was for sure, it was a privilege, especially in a third world country like Peru, especially in the 1980s. 1980s in Peru was very rough. We had tons of terrorism. We weren't like things were really, really rough. And one of the things was that imports were really restricted. Like if you wanted to buy a car, like it doesn't matter if you had the money, like you had to wait like a period of like about 6 months to, have all sorts of paperwork and get your new car. It's so extremely expensive. So extremely privileged. My grandparents from my mother's side, my granddad, he owned a mine or a few mines, and he had like a mining company. He was doing well. And he had, I remember, a computer room already. And again, in Peru, the circumstances really outstanding that he was able to have something like that. So there were computers at home in his place, and I think it kind of like came from that. And my older brother was interested, and we were going to a good high school or a good school that had a computer program and had these computers. So my dad saw that was like kind of like a thing, and he could get one of these hand-me-downs from my granddad. And that's how the first computer arrives. But my dad was not a technologist at all, and neither one in my family. It was just me and my brother trying to figure stuff out.
And just very briefly, without asking you to tell us the whole history of Peru, could you explain maybe in just a couple of minutes why there was terrorism there at that time?
Yeah, there were like 2 or 3 groups that were trying to instill their ways of thinking based. I hope I'm trying to get this correct, but be lenient with me if I don't get all the facts super straight. But there's these trains of thought coming from Maoism and Leninism, and these groups believed that the better good for the country, the better path forward, was following these ideas or ideologies. And because they weren't seeing traction, they started trying to make a point by making violence. So they would blow things up. And this was very sad and very, very, very hard on the country. So things like you would lose power every other day because they would blow up the power towers. They would just blow dynamite. My granddad, who had the mines, he was also like in trouble sometimes because the terrorists would just go in and steal the dynamite, the TNT from his mines. Death threats. It's just really hard. And even today, you can see in Peru, like if you ever go to Lima, it doesn't happen anymore, but you can still see these blocks of concrete in front of police stations. And people are like, why do they have that? Because terrorism, back in the 80s, what they would do is they would put a car in first gear full of explosives and just drive it into the police station and blow it up. So this kind of like would prevent the car to just go all the way into the police station. I mean, pretty rough. But that's kind of roughly why there was this thing going on. And there were like 2 or 3 groups causing all of this trouble.
And one thing I always like to ask people about when they are from a country where I haven't interviewed someone from there before, pre-COVID, what was life like in Peru? I mean, was there a tech sector there?
I think it's starting to change. It's starting to change in Peru, and I would say in Latin America in general. It's still not as strong as I would prefer that to be. I think it's slowly coming. In retrospect, I think Latin America is always like a few years behind of the U.S. or other advanced technology countries. So you're now seeing data centers starting to like kind of like be a thing, whereas like 10 years ago it was like what's a data center? So stuff like that, and there's a lot of good potential, but the ways of getting people to be more knowledgeable on technology and pursuing, even if you say, well, there's no data centers and college or universities are not providing what they need to grow. Now they're the means like to acquire that knowledge and be proficient without having the state or your country providing these tools for you. But so I think that's slowly trying to be a thing, and that's my hope is that not only Peru but the rest of the countries also pick up on that.
Going back to your own story, so you developed this early interest in programming without knowing that it was programming. But at a certain point, you or the people around you realized that you were a very gifted athlete. How did you end up in track and field?
Well, my dad went to the Olympic Games, and he did track and field for many years. He actually lived here in the U.S. He went to college in the U.S. and decided to go back to Peru. So sports was always in the family. My mom, she started as a swimmer. She actually at some point had the national record for the medley with her sisters. So another family coming with strong sports influences. And then she went on to be a discus thrower. And that's how she met my dad. They went to I think it was a Bolivarian Games. Bolivarian Games is kind of like a mini Olympics from all the Bolivarian countries, so mostly South America. And that's how they met. And but my dad never, like, people think that my dad kind of like forced me to do stuff. Like, no, it was me. I said, I really like this. I want to do it. I really want to do this seriously. I was kind of like doing it like on and off and down. It's like, I really want to put all my chips in. I want to do this thing. What do I need to do to be like the best? And that's how I started.
Yeah, I never even remotely got close to the level that you had in my own life. But one of the things I always really loved about track and field generally was the variety. So things like discus and javelin and, running and jumping and things like that. Was there a particular reason you sort of focused in on high jumping?
Yes, a couple. One of them is that I was excelling at that. One of the ways that my dad has of teaching was like, no, you're first an athlete, then you're narrowing down into high jump or hurdles or whatever. I was a pretty good hurdler. My dad had the national record. I almost got the national record and missed it, but in any case, I was excelling at high jump. Was one of the events that I'm doing pretty good, and it snowballs. It snowballs, and it's like, I'm really good. It's like, I think I like this a little bit more than the other stuff because I'm excelling at it. And it's like, if I put a little bit more effort, then I'm a little bit better. It's like, so it's like one thing leads to another, and then suddenly you're like, I'm really good. And the other thing is that it feels really spectacular. Like when you're just running and stepping on the track and just flying over the air, and you're like, woo! It's like people are like, whoa, that's kind of nifty, And I like that. I really enjoy that.
And I think you're the first person who's competed at the Olympics. You were being rather modest in your description of your performance, but that was, I think, I don't know if I mentioned it yet, but you were the first world junior champion in track and field for Peru. So which Olympics did you go to, I guess? That's my first question about that.
I went to the 2004 Olympics. Those were in Athens.
Oh, wow. Okay. And I guess if you could talk for a couple of minutes about what was that like. I mean, I think a lot of people, my understanding is that when you compete in you only sort of arrive a couple days before and you kind of generally leave right after. So you kind of dip in and out of the athletes' village.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. Man, this is a little bit hard for me to talk about. And let me give you a little bit of context on why. For the longest time, I felt very self-conscious about my sports background, and it was so because when I came here, it was really hard on my family. My dad was actually trying to keep me in Peru, and he said, well, you're going to have it super hard out there, Alfredo, because nobody knows you. Here in Peru, everybody knows you. Like I have it in the just recently put some front pages of the most important newspaper in Peru in the walls at home. That so people knew who I was. I was getting in front of the TV and radio stations and getting interviewed all the time. So it was kind of like a big deal. But when I came to the U.S., I felt great that nobody knew me, and I was going to build a name by myself, and I was going to start from scratch. And it's going to take me a lot of work, but I'm in it. I want to do this, and slowly but surely, yes, people would recognize me because I was giving a presentation over here or talking about Python over there, and kind of like that was really great. So I always held back, and I would never advertise that I went to Olympics or that I was a world junior champion in high jump, the first the only world champion in track and field for Peru. And people at work would find out later, and they would just not believe it. And they would come and ask me. So I was very self-conscious. I didn't want to come off as a show-off. I didn't want to say, hey, by the way, I went to the Olympic Games. Or by the way, I did this and I did that. And my dad would be really upset about this. It's like, no, you have to say it. People in the U.S., people outside of Peru, like, it's just going to be, this thing is great. How come you're not saying it more? And it's like, I don't know. And it took me a while. And it was recently, I think in the past 2 years, that I just recently put it on my LinkedIn profile, that I put it on my Twitter account, and just very recently. And I'm coming to terms to it. And I think the reason why is that I finally feel like successful enough of course, this is just a road to becoming better and better. By no means it signals that I've made it. But I feel successful enough. I feel good enough that I can say, oh yes, I'm writing books, or I'm working as a software engineer and I'm presenting here. But I'm also coming from a background in track and field, and the reason that I also like to say it is because it exemplifies, it kind of like shows that I was determined to do something, and I did it. Like it was very hard, and because otherwise, how can you explain if you're like someone that really can own something and have like the responsibility and the ownership to just pull through and make something happen? If you can say, well, I did this, but it wasn't the Olympic Games, it was just 15 years of my life. I remember once I was getting interviewed and this lady said, oh, so how many months have you been training for the Olympics? It's like, well, it's like about 15 years. I don't know, what do you mean? Like how many months? Like it doesn't work that way. It's just all your life. So that's kind of like how I feel about that, but I'm way more comfortable about it these days.
And I'm really curious. So you were sort of like at the peak of things, and was there a moment when you're like, I'm going to stop competing, and this isn't going to be such a big part of 3 times a day kind of part of my life anymore? And what was
it was pretty hard. And I actually you're making all the best questions here. I was one of the only professional athletes, track and field athletes in Peru. I mean, professional track and field athletes don't just happen in Peru. But Bell South, which was a phone company back in the 90s, they were doing very well. They have operations in South America. They, of course, had operations in Peru. And then they decided, like, oh, there's this dude. He's doing pretty well. Seems like a good guy, like a good image for our brand. We're going to sponsor him. And I was sponsored with, there was a tennis player and a couple of rally race car drivers. And I was like, oh, this is great. And the contract was for like 4 or 5 years, I think. And things ended pretty bad. I had an exclusive or exclusivity clause in my contract, meaning I couldn't come up with my any other brand, any other competing brand. I couldn't be sponsored by any other brand. So while I was competing in the Olympic Games, they were under financial strain, and they eventually sold out. Like here in the US, they sold to AT&T, I think. In South America, they sold to the Spanish telco, which is Telefonica. And so they were getting rid of stuff, and basically they got rid of me, and they sent me a really rough 4 or 5 page letter to the address of my parents' house in Lima while I was in the Olympic Games. They were cutting me off. And my dad didn't tell me, of course, until the Olympics were done. And the letter said, you've violated the terms of our agreement, because there was a big photograph of mine coming up, jumping in an event that had happened 2 weeks before the Olympic Games, which were the Ibero-American championships in Spain. And the number, I think it's called bib, my number on my T-shirt, on my shirt had Vodafone, because Vodafone was sponsoring the event. But this is something that is very well stipulated in international the International Track and Field Federation, which is athlete A being sponsored by a company like, say, Nike, and going to an event that is sponsored by Adidas, like has to use Adidas. Like, there's no way. Otherwise, you don't compete. So I had to compete. So they grabbed a technicality and got rid of my contract. But I have this letter printed out along with a picture, and my dad really struggled with that. He thought it was like super negative, but to me it was very negative, and it signaled my decline and the idea of like, I need to stop doing this and just trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. But for me, it was the lowest of the low in my career, being let go by the company that had, sponsored me, they believed in me. And then suddenly it's like, I actually had 20 something scholarships to come here to the US that I declined because it was to compete in the NCAA, and the NCAA regulations consider you a professional even if you get $100 a year sponsorship or a one-time $10. There's a dollar amount, but I think it's pretty ridiculous. Either 50 or $100, then you're considered a pro. You're not allowed to compete in NCAA. So I told him, it's like, my future, like, I'm betting on you guys just as you are betting on me. I'm gonna not going to go to the US, not going to the NCAA thing, and I'm gonna stay here in Peru. And they decided to do this other thing. So these things I printed out represents to me a low in my life, but it also represents that being so low there that I could just reinvent who I was and my goals in life, and I wanted to be better. And I think I've kind of like succeeded to some extent to do that, like I'm no longer, this is the Olympian dude. No, it's just, this is the dude that writes software and does this thing, does the other thing, so.
And why did you choose to move to thank you, by the way, for sharing all of that. I really appreciate that. And I'm sure our listeners will as well. Why did you choose to move to the U.S.?
Well, we had, my wife had family here, and that made it easier. And, in Peru, we were struggling my wife, we couldn't find work. She had graduated a year and a half or 2 years earlier, and she was unable to find work. We were living in my in-laws' house. We lived there for a year. And we thought, well, we need to make a decision. Either we stay here in Peru, and we tried. We stayed there in Peru trying to look for another sponsorship. My dad kind of like tried to put all of his energies in trying to make that happen. I was burned out. I was working out pretty brutal hours, and I wasn't seeing the results anymore. And I thought, I think I'm gonna make it happen. But my dad would ask me, "It's like, what do you think is going to happen in the U.S.?" Like, well, I don't know. I'll figure it out. Something like, I think I have this plan. I'll just do some personal training. I'll just be a coach, and my wife will find some work, and then we'll take it from there. And ended up being kind of like that, but very different in the end.
And we were talking a little bit before we started recording the interview, but one thing that's now a feature of, I think, most podcasts is how has COVID-19 affected you professionally? And I guess specifically, what are things like in Atlanta right now? I mean, I know you're in the Atlanta region.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit up north of Atlanta, but I don't think it has changed much professionally for me. Like I still work my day-to-day stuff. I'm working these days with a company that does security analysis of containers called Anchor. But I've been working remotely for the past 8 years or so, fully remote, and 10 years almost all the time remote. So things they don't seem so much different than before, except for the fact that I don't have the occasional going out thing. I would say like the state is doing okay-ish. There are some controversial measures of opening and reopening the beaches or reopening businesses early. So that's a little bit stressful, but the things are okay. So professionally, the same. Nothing has. It's kind of like when we have a snow day, and my kids are like, "Oh, we have the day off," because as soon as it snows, Atlanta shuts down, and it's like that. Like, don't you have the day off? It's like, no, that doesn't work that way for a remote worker. Like it doesn't matter if there's snow outside. And but other than that, I'm sharing my home with my sister and brother-in-law and their family. They have 3 kids, and they're staying with us they were caught almost in the middle of this, in the transition from moving from one state to the other, and so they're staying with us these days. Which and like you said, we were talking about this before we started, but it makes the logistics of everything pretty difficult. Going to buy groceries for 10 people, which is very different than than buying for one or two people. And everyone, of course, these my nephews are almost like almost all of them are teenagers, and they were like three people in one.
Yes, it's really interesting. One thing we were talking about before, but I was hoping you would be willing to share in the interview is that people kind of think you're a hoarder when you go shopping. Because they don't believe you when you say that you're managing 10 people. And I'm sure that there are probably very few people listening to this who are in like a household with like 10 people in it. But I'm sure we've all had a similar experience where we've got some particular thing in our life that makes us a little bit different from other people, and operating under new circumstances requires, not just adaptation on our own part, but understanding from other people as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Judging others or judging other situations is just so easy. It's the low-hanging fruit. It doesn't take much effort. You see something that doesn't quite look okay, and then you immediately draw your conclusions, and you say something, or you post something, or you tweet something, and there's always something a little bit beyond that, right? So we go there's restrictions in the supermarkets on how much chicken you can buy, how much pork you can buy, and it's like, oh, it's just half a chicken per family, and you're like, well, but like we're 10 people, like it's me, my wife, my 3 kids, and my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, and their 3 kids, and we have 2 dogs. Like their 2 dogs are also here, so it's you're trying to get these things working out, but you try to cope with it, but we're lucky because it's family and we love each other, and we're lucky that we have each other to survive this thing together.
Yeah, thanks again for sharing that. I'm glad to hear you're with your family, and you guys are safe and comfortable and managing things, and that you're working from home means you're relatively protected from some of the things that are affecting all of us. And so moving on to the next part of the interview, I wanted to ask you about your work at Anchor. So you said, security around containers, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I'm sure you get this question from people who are sort of not in the computer world, but if you could talk a little bit about like what containers are and what Anchor does. Yeah,
well, the funny thing is that I have it much easier than my previous job. I was doing distributed storage for like about 6 or 7 years, working with the team that created Ceph. Ceph is a distributed file storage system, and that's just very tricky to explain. So when someone comes like, what is it that you do in technology? Do you do work with computers? Like, well, how do I explain distributed storage? It's just so complicated. Oh, you mean like the cloud? Well, yes, kind of, like, sort of. But now it's much easier. I just say not security. I just analyze what's going on there in a computer or server, and then we come up with like, oh, this thing has a security vulnerability here, and that thing is not safe, and here's a report, and you can take some actions. But so maybe you ask a couple of granular questions there. So containers it's this level of abstraction. Back in the 90s, you say, oh, I'm going to run a website, so you have to like have your physical server plugged in this computer that looked like a big pancake and just stacked into a rack, and that rack would have other ginormous pancakes with flashing lights, and then you would just turn on your website, and your website will be living there, which is kind of like a computer. And then technology progressed, and we had the virtual server, which is a thing that kind of like mimics that thing. It's like that you can have 10 or 20 or whatever number living inside of a physical computer. So that was abstracted. And then the container is a step beyond that, I think, or at least that's the way I try to explain it in easy terms, which is it's a very thin abstraction which allows you to virtualize applications and make them work. So we grab these things which are compressed in, they call them images, and then we uncompress them and analyze them and try to find what might be wrong with them and make a good rapport with it, which I think is pretty cool.
And how do you analyze? A container is kind of like, the idea is that you should be able to have all the things that make something work kind of in a metaphorical software box. But now you've got all these boxes, and there can be something going on inside one box that's not going on inside another box. And so you guys, I don't claim to understand exactly what you do, but this presents companies who are using containers with a security vulnerability, a particular kind of security vulnerability. And so what you do is companies give you access to their software, and then you go in there and you look inside the container?
Yes. So there's different various interactions that you can have. There's an open source version that you can run. So the idea is that you will run this service somewhere in your infrastructure, and then when it's running, like it's basically on premise that you're running this, you're installing this service within your system, wherever that is. Like if you want to run it on Amazon, you could. And what happens there is that you can analyze individual images, and you can say, I've created this image, I'm just going to push it here. And then you grant access to the container registry. So a registry, for those who might not know what it is it's basically a collection, like the service that collects all of the images available. And that could be private, or that could be Docker Hub, which is the public registry that most everyone uses for Docker images. So to some extent, yes, you have to grant access to the service to analyze these container images.
Well, actually, one thing I wanted to ask you, I should have actually included in the previous part of the interview, but in addition to your work that you do professionally, you've also been a speaker on a number of different things, as I mentioned in the introduction. And I was scrolling through your Twitter feed doing research for this interview, and I saw that you were supposed to be speaking at the PyCon Peru 2020 conference in late March. Did that actually happen?
It didn't. It didn't, and such a bummer, and especially so because it's Peru, and my background and in sports and everything, it felt to me kind of like my going back and being a keynote speaker for a technology event was opening up, not necessarily opening up opportunities for me, but kind of like making me feel like, yes, yeah, I'm getting even more recognition for being someone else other than the athlete that was track and field, like a successful track and field athlete. That didn't happen. Ended up canceling, just like a bunch of other travel that I had planned. But I think it's for the best, but it's just a major bummer. Not necessarily because of the keynote speaking, but again because it was Peru. I was really looking forward to that, and having had the opportunity to be given the opportunity to go and talk in keynote, I think is great, and I really enjoy giving presentations. It's one of the things that I really like, even way before when I was in school. Like I really like standing in front of people and telling stories. I think it's great. Very sad that didn't happen. Hopefully we can make PyCon Peru happen again soon.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. One of the but this is the kind of thing that's been affecting a lot of people, and in particular, LeanPub authors are often people who give conference talks, and in fact, that for some of our authors, that actually is a pretty important part of their income, if they're paid to give presentations to companies and conferences and things like that. And everybody's really kind of scrambling right now and uncertain about the future. And one thing, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but O'Reilly actually just permanently canceled their conferences business, their in-person conferences business. And this is they're pretty smart cookies over at O'Reilly. And if they have made a decision like that, anyway, to me, that's been this is just kind of anecdotal, but that's been the most ominous sign for me for sort of conferences in this sector going forward.
Yeah. I heard the news as well. I think it's, I think O'Reilly does wonderful events. It's a major bummer, all these people being let go. My hope is that, a while ago, I heard this interview and the interviewer was asking these questions about these terrible times, but before even the COVID situation that we're living in, and this person answered in a way that I can really relate to, and hopefully anyone that is listening to the podcast can feel good about this. And this person said, "Yes, we are living through these very complicated times, and things are complicated, things are difficult, but that can only mean that when we're coming out, we will come better and stronger and more aware of what things were bad and how lucky we are that we're having our chance to make it better." So to me, it feels like we're hunkering down. We're in our homes, not being able to have all of the freedoms. Let's appreciate more of that. Let's put the extra effort in thinking about all these other people that, I don't remember when there was so much gratitude to these people in the front lines, just doing so much work, the caretakers, and putting their lives at risk. And so many have lost their lives trying to help others. And I don't remember a time where that was, there was that awareness, that level of awareness. So I think that's great. And I think that's when we come out of this problem, we will be much better. And this tremendous opportunity to make things even better and be more, less judgmental when it's so easy to do, and more aware of things.
Yeah, that's a very great observation. Thank you for that. You're reminding me that a couple of weeks ago here where I live on my street, people started banging pots and shouting at 7 p.m. to celebrate the frontline workers.
Wow.
It's this really touching thing. Like, Canadians don't typically do collective stuff like that. And it's funny, like I work from home myself. I'm looking out at my street through this beautiful, windows all day long. And every day at 7, there's this reminder there are actually people in those houses living their lives, doing things, and they all come out and celebrate what we're all, the people who are taking the biggest risks to help the rest of us who are suffering the most right now. And that's a great thing. And it is a hopeful sign for maybe a changed approach to life going forward. Moving on to the next part of the interview, I'd like to talk to you about your books. And so I guess the first thing is you've co-authored them with Noah Gift, who I actually interviewed last week. So that interview will be coming out on the podcast just before this one. But how did you and Noah become colleagues and co-authors?
Noah has changed my life more than once, and he's been a tremendous source of positive influence in my life. He's an amazing human being. I met him while I was a system administrator in a very small media agency. My office was not an office. It was the server room. So I would put my chair right next to the rack of servers inside a very freezing room inside of this small company. And the company needed someone to do something with Python. They were primarily doing PHP. And so Noah was contracting, like he was living in the Atlanta area at that time, and he got hired. So I was told, like, hey, there's a new person coming in. Said he's still. I wasn't only the system administrator. I was also the IT guy. Like printer was not working, you would call me. Like you need to go to the data center, like that's me as well. Like a network cables, yeah, you need to ask me. All of those things was me. So system administrator was take it with a grain of salt. So I was setting his computer up, and then we started talking a little bit, and then he really likes sports. He's very passionate about sports. So yeah, so I told him, like, yeah, so I did a little bit of sports. Like I said, like I wouldn't advertise any of my background things. Like, oh yeah, really? So you did sports? Like what kind of sports? Well, I did, track and field. Oh, really? Like and Noah says, well, I also did track and field. It's like, oh, that's great. And then he would say, well, so what what event you did in track and field, Alfredo? I was like, well, I did the high jump. It's like, oh. No, and Noah's like, I also did the high jump. It's like, oh, and Noah did the decathlon. So he was a decathlete. So of course he did the high jump. And he's like, oh yeah. So I was like, oh, I jumped these. And how much did you jump? It's like, well, I jumped, I think it's 7.4, which is 227, 2 meters, 27 centimeters, which I think is 7.4 or close to 7 feet, 4 inches. And he was like, whoa, wait a second.
Yeah, the ball dropped there.
That doesn't sound quite right. Like, what's going on? So he pressed me and it's like, yeah, I went to the Olympics. It's like, you went to the Olympics? What is going on? Like, that's insane. So we became friends and we started working together. And he said, hey, I think you really need to learn some Python. And I was like, well, this is horrible to say, but like I said, well, I don't know. No, I know Bash. I think I'm pretty proficient in this thing. I don't why would I need to learn Python? Show me how I run a system command in Python. We're system administrators are always restarting servers and installing dependencies. And it's like, show me how I run a system command. So it's like, well, you import this thing and you run this thing and pass it through a pipe. It's like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. I can do this with one line in Bash. Why would I ever do this in Python? It's like, oh, you don't understand. So he got me convinced. And then he said, choose one thing that you want to automate out of your day-to-day stuff and write it in Python. And then every Friday we'll sit down, review it, and we'll take it from there. And that's how I started learning. So he basically pushed me to learn Python. And then after a couple of weeks, I swear it was like 2 or 3 weeks learning Python, he said, okay, so you need an objective in your life. So you need to present the next PyCon in Atlanta, which was 2010. So I started learning Python in 2009. It's like 2009, PyCon is in Atlanta, you need to present. It's like, how am I going to possibly present something that I just learned? No way. So he said, no, you need to do it. You need an objective, you need to submit a presentation, a proposal, and see what happens. And lo and behold, I submitted a proposal, and that was the only time that I was able to get accepted at PyCon and presented in 2010. So that's how I met him, and that was back in 2010.
And when did you guys decide to write books together?
So after being with Noah for a while here in Atlanta, he went off to New Zealand and then to San Francisco and then stayed in California for a while. And then I moved around and kind of lost contact with him for a little bit. I would just always try to every now and then try to give him a call and chat with him, but we weren't in touch a lot. And what happened was that one day we started talking about things that we should be trying to do together. He was doing all of these training and he wanted to pull me in and try to do some stuff together. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. No, yeah, I mean, that I'm more like a hands-on person. I can't just learn something and just start teaching it. And there was some talk about doing some cloud-related stuff. He's very, very big on cloud things. And then the year started, this is last year. Can you imagine this? This last year started and it was January. It's like, Alfredo, how about we do this book with O'Reilly called Python for DevOps? And I said, okay, yeah, let's do this. Don't go too crazy on me with the topics, but yeah, I have tons of DevOps experience, so I felt confident enough that at least a chunk of chapters could be mine. I could own them and be good. And we did, and then we later partnered with two more authors, Kennedy Berman and Greek Georgiou, amazing guys, and we knocked that out in 4 or 5 months. We went full steam ahead, and that's how it started. And so we finished, and the book was finally published by Riley in December. And January comes, I think it's January 2nd or 3rd, and then I talked to Noah and I said, no, you know what? I want to write another book, and I don't want to stop. I think this is going well, and I've heard this thing called LeanPub. It sounds really neat. It sounds more of like the stuff that aligns more with the way I work, or the way I would want to work with books, because technology books, they can get so out of date so quickly. And even if they don't, like, they have a lifetime, and then they die. Like, what are you going to do? Like a Python book from 10 years ago is not that useful today. Even if it is somewhat useful, it won't be as useful as someone writing a book with the most recent version of Python today. So it was enticing to me. And I actually read the story or one of the blog posts of this guy that wrote the Ansible for DevOps book in LeanPub.
Yeah.
Yes, Geerling. Yeah. So I remember seeing his repositories for Ansible for a while. Geerling guy is his his nick on GitHub, and I remember reading that. And it's like, well, I think this is great. And writing for O'Reilly was a great experience. So I loved it, but I wanted to kind of like go on a different route. And I talked to Noah, and Noah said, yeah, oh my goodness, that sounds great. Yeah, okay, let's do it. And we started. And while we were writing, the first book was Testing in Python. While we were writing that, Noah liked it so much that we brainstormed on two more books. And the other book was Minimal Python, which we just finished. And then the other one is command line tools in Python, and so we've been cranking out a book every 6 weeks almost.
And do you plan on continuing to write more?
So that's a great question. I don't know, it's been a pretty brutal schedule. Trying to crank out a book every 6 weeks, it's just been it's been brutal. I don't have any other way to put it. So I want to not necessarily stop writing books, but I want to continue to improve the books that we have and expand on the things surrounding the books as well. And again, like, one of the things that I really like about LeanPub is that we could have this iterative approach on writing and republishing and putting another version and another version. And I think that's great. But I have my brother-in-law is with me. He's more of like a manager, but has like a background in mechanical engineering, and he's picked up Minimal Python. It's like, oh, well, he doesn't know Python. And it's like, he's picking up on it. And it's like, well, it would be really cool if you could expand on these or add on that or reword these. And I'm up for that. Like, we haven't written these books to just say, oh yeah, we did it, checkbox, done. We're going to do, I don't know, movies now. We really want to make these things great. And so we're thinking all these different ways that we can make that happen. So.
Yeah, that's a great story. That you guys are the canonical LeanPub authors, right? We're writing about something that can change, so we want to have books that we can update, and we're using our readers as resources for improving our books and guidance for how we can make them better. And so that's just fantastic to hear. The last question I always like to ask people on this podcast, if they're LeanPub authors, is in your experience using LeanPub, if there was one feature we could build for you, or one problem we could fix for you, what would you ask us to do?
For me as an author?
Yeah. It can be
yes.
as personal and unique as you like.
I do have one thing that is just really, really tricky. And whenever I need to make changes to my book, either generate a new version or change some setting, I can never, ever find the right menu or how to get to the menu that I need. And so I have to go to this one URL that has the drop down, and then I can just drill down. So some sort of reordering of the menus would be greatly appreciated because I can never find my way around.
Yeah, you can't. No one can see, but I'm laughing because thank you very much for sharing that. We are aware that we introduced a new navigation system on the website a while ago, and we realized that it was not the right approach, and we're redesigning the whole thing right now. One thing I would say to any Leanpub author is that if you're working on your book, you can go to like your book landing page and just go to /overview. And then that shows you all the menu items on one page in categories, like store, where you can do coupons and make packages. So there is a one page you can go to that you should definitely bookmark for your book, where you can get all the links. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. We really appreciate that kind of feedback. And the navigation system is something that we're fixing, that we're going to make hopefully way better and more clear. We just basically, the short version of it is we got a bit too clever and up our own ass, instead of thinking about things from the sort of like, what does a new user need to see? What does someone who's actually grinding away on a book like need to be able to get to quickly and easily? And yeah, right now there are a lot of things where like people are like, it's like I can't, even seasoned Leanpub authors are like, I can't find what I'm looking for, which is pretty embarrassing for us. So we're working on a fix to that.
That's that's a great thing to do, Len, to ask about. I think as people that produce a product and having some looking forward to get some feedback, even if it's not quite like positive, I think it's great. But you asked me something that could be improved, but I would like to add that so far we're in love with the whole platform. We're using GitHub Actions to talk to the API and auto-generate our books. I think that's great. Not having to just go and click and everything. So having the API is fantastic. So if there are other Leanpub authors listening to the podcast, and if they haven't used the API, it's just great. It's really nice, and using it on GitHub with the GitHub Actions thing, it's just perfect. You just add the API token and everything gets published. So that's really nifty. So Noah and I were collaborating on GitHub, so we're submitting our stuff, and when we merge our PRs to master, the new version of the book gets out, and it's perfect.
Yeah, thanks very much for the kind words. we appreciate that too. And yeah, our more sophisticated users really do like the API and sort of coming up with their own workflows, and working together with someone else comes with its own issues. But thankfully we've got modes of writing like GitHub and Bitbucket and stuff like that, where there's this entire brilliant services that are built to help people work together creating texts. Which is what some code is and what a book is. Well, Alfredo, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview today. We really appreciate it. And thanks to you and Noah for using Leanpub as a platform for your latest books. Yeah,
absolutely. Again, we're tremendously passionate about producing good content. I think Leanpub is a great place to develop and produce our content, and I think it's a great platform. Hopefully, more authors realize that and start using it. And I really want to thank you for all of your thoughtful questions and an awesome interview. I really enjoyed my time chatting with you.
Thanks very much. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter Podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Leanpub author, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.